Welcome, everybody. This is Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. We're now in the fourth class, and we're talking about Freemasonry, properly the ancient and accepted rite of Freemasonry. And it's going to be a little bit of a shift of emphasis in this class, which is that rather than front-loading this with a lot of historical details about the history of the movement in question, instead I'm going to be more focusing on the formal characteristics of the actual practice of Freemasonry as a club, as something that people get together and do together as a ritual procedure. And then its significance, I think, particularly for our own purposes as well, is then going to emerge on that basis when we see how the system of Freemasonry is structured as a system of ritual initiation and how and why this works. And then the magical function, at least potentially, of something like a system of initiation set up like the system of Freemasonry will become apparent. And we don't have to get bogged down in the history of how Freemasonry came about or the controversies historically that have surrounded it. Another thing about Freemasonry that's important is that it's basically modern in the same way that we are. So some of the earlier movements and figures that we've been looking at, their modernity is behind ours in a little bit. So when we were looking at Jacob Burma, and some of the other figures in the period of the period of the Reformation, or also the what we could call the Baroque period of the long 1600s, the 17th century. And superficially, at least, and especially from the perspective of people living in those times, they perceived and understood what was happening to them as just a continuation of the medieval Christian, Latin Christian culture that had preceded their experience, even though we can look at the period that they're in and we can see that it's already turning into the modernity that we can recognize. Some of that very immediately with things like the printing press. So there's printed books, and also people have the warfare that's going on is using guns and artillery. And so they've stopped, for the most part, wearing armor because it's no longer really effective against guns, or at least stopped wearing armor in the way that they did in the medieval period. So the monk in armor on horseback is now obsolete, for example, even though people are, of course, still using horses in warfare. But and the structure of people's experience is beginning to shift. And one way of characterizing that is to say that the focus of normative subjectivity in culture and society is moving away from the feudal nobility as what we might call the characters of history. And now there's a new type of historical subjectivity that's historically emerging in this period we call modernity. And this is based on the class experience of a different group of people, namely the burgher or bourgeois or middle or lower upper class in the that we still have with us as sort of the center of gravity of our contemporary experience. And so Freemasonry is focused on, like the types of Christianity that emerged after the Reformation, is focused on the subjectivity of this emerging literate, urban, middle class that are now this thing called civic society now in a modern sense. And so the participants of Freemasonry, this is basically a kind of club for gentlemen, and it is gender segregated. And so it only admits men. and this is understood in a pretty cisnormative sense. And um, I'm just going to note that, and we don't have time to really go into um, the controversy surrounding that. There is such a thing called co-masonry, which is a masonry that admits all genders, and the various types of ritual magic that correlate to the Masonic form of ritual that are practiced in the modern magical traditions are, of course, all um, co-Masonic, whether that's Gardnerian witchcraft, which of course admits all genders, as well as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, OTO, other magical orders. In Freemasonry itself, it was and to a large extent remains gender segregated. And this is, of course, because in the context of patriarchy, the gentleman, and here we do mean men, is the normative figure in society. And so this is a club for those people. And part of the idea of this is so that they can have something to do that's not just at home with their family or at work. And so this is then a social context. In the 1700s, this is often done in pubs, which of course we need to recognize in places like England are also literally public houses in the sense that you would have even business meetings or other types of organized get-togethers. You would use the pub, which is of course also a restaurant, which is also sometimes a lodging hotel for travelers, which is also a place where people congregate for their meals to get out of their houses. And so it's not a bar in the American sense of the term, even though alcohol is, of course, sometimes copiously served in a Masonic context, as is, of course, also the custom in Parliament, where some of those MPs are often quite liquored up, and that has historically contributed sometimes to the combative nature of parliamentary debate. But I digress. So this modern quality of Freemasonry is also underscores its ongoing relevance for us as well. It continues to be a kind of format for organizing a club, whether that's for just social purposes or more esoteric functions. So I'm going to say just a few brief things about the origins of Freemasonry without getting too much into that. There's an enormous amount of basically bogus and often surprisingly boring writing within a Masonic context about their own history. This is often preposterously exaggerated or basically detached from any criteria of legitimate historical scholarship. Basically, the historical basis for the emergence of Freemasonry is that in the 1600s, in the 17th century, particularly in the late 17th century, under these conditions of a new emerging urban prosperous middle class, Freemasonry emerges as a social club, originally in Scotland, and then from there it spreads into England and France and basically everywhere else throughout Europe, and then it spread with colonialism to the rest of the world. And it becomes extremely popular. By the end of the 1700s, in the time of the French Revolution, probably about 90% of the British nobility are members of Freemasonry, basically as a club for them to be in. And it is mostly a gentleman's club in England and always has been. When I attempted to visit the Mark Mason's Lodge, that's just a degree of higher degree masonry, that's in London, where the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn outer order ritual initiations took place in this building. It's where Crowley probably received his neophyte initiation in the 1890s. Um, I when my partner Carrie and I showed up at the door to try to walk in, we discovered they had a sign up that said that all ladies had to wear um, shoe length, ankle length dresses, and that men needed to um, be wearing ties and jackets and dress shoes, that the tennis shoes or sports shoes were not allowed. And so I couldn't go in. um, um, and in American Masonry, which, by the way, I am an initiate, I am a third degree Master Mason, initiated in the early 2000s at Oakland Durant Rockridge Lodge, number 188 in Oakland. It was expected that you would make some effort to dress up a little bit. I don't think I ever wore a tie. I had just a collared shirt, my blazer, Dockers, and I did not wear dress shoes. And they had a little till outside the door with aprons in it. You just grab one of those and tie it on when you went in to sit down for the meeting. So much more much more informal. But so it emerges in Scotland, and then its structure is regularized, made more regular in the early 1700s by the formation of something called the United Grand Lodge of England, from which basically all of the contemporary current Freemasonic rites, practicing regular Blue Lodge of the first 3 degrees, so-called, of Masonry, are either chartered from, they derive from it either by being chartered by that body or being in some kind of schism at some point for whatever reason from it. Regular Freemasonry is considered the basic 3 degrees, which are called the Blue Lodge Freemasonry. And those are entered apprentice, which is 1st degree, fellow craft, which is 2nd degree, and being a so-called master mason, which is the 3rd degree. That's the whole of basic Freemasonry, and all higher upper degree systems are considered to be commentaries then, or developments of that basic Freemason, of that basic form. So if you've done those 3 degrees, you're considered to be a full Freemason, and you have full visiting and voting rights at any Masonic lodge in the world, if you're a man. Again, this is a part of the controversy, again, that we're not going to get into today, because I want to cover the magical form of the of Freemasonry, which is what's important for our own tradition. Anyway, Freemasonry develops in various jurisdictions. Usually these are national. In the United States, because this is such a large country, there is no national Grand Lodge for Freemasonry, but each state in the federal union has its own Grand Lodge, which is equivalent to a national Grand Lodge in Europe, where the territories are of similar size. There are also dependently administered observances, usually that practice different popular high-grade forms of Freemasonry. Basically, these are clubs that you join after you join. There are more clubs that you can go to meetings for and dress up and do these rituals. The 2 most important in the United States are the so-called York Rite and the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. And then there's other types of observances. Some of them occult, some of them not. So there's various so-called Scottish observances. There's the so-called Templar rites. And there's this thing called the Grand Orient, which is the main, historically the main Grand Lodge in France, which broke away from the English Grand Lodge, and they was denounced by the upstanding Christian British Freemasons, because Grand Orient is officially a deist observance, and so references to the great architect of the universe were removed or amended from the rituals, so that you can be an atheist and a libertine and join the join the French Masonic system, because of course they would have you do that there, and of course the upstanding bourgeois English are gonna turn their noses up at that kind of irresponsible shenanigans. Okay, and then of course there's all kinds of various rites of co-masonry, which is a gender inclusive form that works the basic Blue Lodge degrees, and which on that basis I think can be considered actually the truly normative form of from Freemasonry. But don't I kind of got in trouble at one point in Finland. I was at this in 2019 in the summer. I went to a few academic conferences on Western esotericism in Europe, and one of those conferences was in Tampere, which is the second largest city in Finland after Helsinki. It's just a short train ride from the capital, southern part of the peninsula. And there was a colloquium being put on specifically focused on esotericism in relationship to Freemasonry. And so I got to visit the Masonic lodge that they had there. And apparently I was told during one of the Q&As, they were doing a segment that Masons invariably do. They're always trying to figure out why they're losing members and how they can get more members, because they're declining and have been for most of the last, half century or whatever. So, and so they're always trying to figure out why this is happening. And then, so, I raise my hand and I'm like, well, if you want new members, you're excluding half of the population here. Why don't you just recognize co-masonry, and you can expand your membership base, by not excluding half of the people that are, potential members, that are here. And I was told later by somebody who had been in the room, with approval, I might note, that I'd scandalized the regular Masons who were there. But of course, if you can't listen to why you're actually, in decline, then of course you're just going to continue to be in decline, and then doing these questionnaires and stuff, and then you're, asking the same questions that are the wrong questions again and again. And of course, you're not going to get the answers that mean anything. And there's easy things that could be done, but the, old men involved don't, because they have this kind of our club attitude, and they don't want to change. And so there's this kind of gatekeeping that goes on. And again, it's like any club. So, okay. So let's talk about the basic structure of Freemasonry. I'm going to share my screen. Joe, would you be so good as to read where it says 7 Freemasons, etc.? Don't worry, we're not going to read all of this, but it's just, this, by the way, is Duncan's Ritual of Freemasonry, which you can pick up at any used bookstore. It has all the secrets of Freemasonry in it. So anybody can look at these rituals. Joe, go ahead and read.
7 Freemasons. These 6 entered apprentices and 1 master mason, acting under a charter of dispensation from some grand lodge, is the requisite number to constitute a lodge of masons to initiate a candidate to the first degree of masonry. They assembled in a room well guarded from all Cohens and eavesdroppers in the 2nd or 3rd story, as the case may be, of some building suitably prepared and furnished for lodge purposes, which is by Masons termed the ground floor of King Solomon's temple.
Okay, so that's good, thanks. So what's going on here is that although this isn't apparent in the first degree, as you move to the higher degrees, it becomes clear that there's a symbolic overlap between um, the the building of King Solomon's temple and the alleged mythological, not to be taken literally, origins of Freemasonry. So they're creating a myth of origins where um, they link the origins of stonemasonry as a kind of guild that existed in the medieval period. This is what's called operative masonry, meaning you're actually building stone buildings, particularly the cathedrals. And these guilds would have what are called lodges, which would be buildings they'd set up at work sites where workers coming from a distance could be fed and housed. And then so that you would know that you were part of the club, a member of the guild, you would pay some money to get initiated into the guild. And they would have a little ritual where you were brought in, where you were probably given a password and maybe like a special grip or something like that to identify you as a member of the guild. And that's about it. Would connect in any way with so Freemasonry, which is called speculative Freemasonry, meaning it speculates about the allegorical esoteric meanings of the tools and of Freemasonry and the symbols related to that, but which does not actually build buildings and is not actually a guild, but a club. When they get together, their groups are called lodges, and you need 7 people to have a lodge, and any 7 people can get together and basically get a charter and start their own club at their pub. Basically, this is like in any town in let's say you're in 18th century England, and you and your fellow prosperous shop owners in town want to have a club at your pub. Okay, well, there's maybe a dozen or 2 of you, so you apply to the United Grand Lodge of England and you get a charter, and then you all dress up in suits. The worshipful master wears a hat, and they take their seats in the lodge, which I'll show you in a moment. Okay, one more thing. The reason they're at an upstairs floor is because it's supposed to be in the Acts of the Apostles when what's called Pentecost, which is when the Holy Spirit sends down little tongues of flame that are represented as resting on to initiate the apostles who are going to go out to spread the message. This is said to occur in an upstairs room. And so Masons meet in upstairs rooms to symbolize the descent of the Holy Spirit. Okay, and then I mentioned King Solomon's temple. So that's both the Old and New Testament kind of symbolic correlations. Ta-da! Here's the layout of a Masonic initiation room. So there's the staircase going up, and then you've got these officers. So the East is at the top. The letter G stands for the great architect of the universe, which is supposed to be God. That could be understood in deistic or more formally theistic terms. And so here's the officers. In the East, wears this hat. This is the worshipful master and sits on the throne in the East. And then there's these 2 seated officers. These officers, along with the worshipful master, generally don't move too much about in the temple and give their speeches usually from their thrones. There's exceptions to that. And these are called wardens. And there's the junior warden who sits in the south here. And then in the west, there's the senior warden. And then there's also these 2 other officers who sit in the the corners. And they each have a staff. And these are called the deacons. And there's a senior and a junior deacon as well. The senior deacon sits up in the East next to the worshipful master, and then the junior deacon here. And the job of the deacons is that they take turns conducting the candidate about the temple as they're circumambulated to visit the different thrones, where then there's speeches that are given to them by the officers during the initiation. Okay, so first, in a Masonic ritual, the lodge is opened. So, by the way, if anybody has any questions at some point, feel free to unmic and ask me that if something's unclear about this as we're going on. Otherwise, if it's a more general question, we'll get to regular Q&A at the end of the at the end of that. But if at some point you don't understand what I'm describing or whatever, you need something, just open your mic and let me know. Okay, so at the beginning, everybody's seated, and then the worshipful master opens the lodge by requesting that it be tiled. And that means guarded. So there's an officer at the door that I haven't mentioned. There's an additional officer, and they're called the tiler. And their only job in the ritual is to sit near the door and make sure nobody comes in, which of course doesn't happen because this is a private club. And anyway, if somebody did come, who was a member, they would, of course, admit them and make sure that they were seated, so that they're kind of an usher, but they're symbolically a guard. So they announced that the lodge is tiled. All the members identify that they're members of the degree by giving the signs of the degree. More on that in a moment. The different officers are announced, and they have little speeches where they describe their function in the ritual. So it's kind of like a little review. Here's the ritual. Here are the officers to remind everybody of what's going on. Also, magically, this activates each of the officers within the ritual by kind of invoking them. More on the magical aspect of this, because of course this is a magic ritual, whether the people involved in it know it or not. In many cases, not. I'm deferring that in discussion until at the end. Okay, so there's then some symbolic wrappings that occur, and then it's declared by the worshipful master that the lodge is open in the first degree. There's various orders of business that can occur. Usually this is the time when there's a business meeting for the lodge. That has its own form. That's not really what we're going to look at today. Instead, what we're concerned with is the initiation of candidates to the first degree. So the candidates are seated in what's called the chamber of reflection, which is an anteroom to the main chamber. And then at a certain point, one of the deacons is set to fetch them and bring them into the temple to be initiated. So this is called being admitted in due form. And what happens is that there's the worshipful master. They've got their gavel, their hat. Let's see. There's some signs. Do I have any more? No, that's it. Okay. So let's just leave it here. So basically the candidate takes off their outer clothing so that they're in their undergarments, which at that time would have included sort of some pantaloons, some under trousers, and also a substantive undershirt. The traditional instructions that are given out at this point state that if the candidate does not have their own set of drawers, that they're to be given one by the lodge to wear as underclothes. The point being that in the 18th century, not everybody was wealthy enough to have a full set of undergarments that they'd be wearing every day. And so you would, of course, be issued that. And then you're blindfolded, and then your sleeves are sort of rolled up in this particular symbolic way that the meaning of isn't really revealed until the third degree. It doesn't really concern us here. And then there's also a toe cable, which is like a noose that's put around your neck, that it's as if symbolically you're being led around by that, as if you were sort of a prisoner who's about to be then emancipated by taking this oath to become a member of the company. And then and I think this is a holdover of medieval military practice, where it was the custom for soldiers from the side that you were attacking, who were captured, would be given the opportunity to enlist because many of these people are mercenaries, and they're there because they're being paid to be there by one side or the other, but they don't have any necessary political loyalty to the side in question. So they would often be given the opportunity to sort of switch paymaster. And if they did that, they would be brought in and they'd take an oath before one of the officers, and then they'd be issued, of course, then they'd be issued a uniform. And so the shackles or whatever that they were being held prisoner with would be released at that point, and they'd be dressed in a uniform and sent off to duty. And so I think this is being replicated in the Masonic ritual. And so they're blindfolded, and then they're admitted to the temple. They're conducted by the deacons in turn, who also speak for them in the speeches. And then what happens is that they're led around the temple in a circle, and then eventually they're brought to the altar in the middle. And this is the altar has what are called the 3 lights of Freemasonry. And what these are, as you can see in the illustration here, here's the altar. There's what's called the Book of Sacred Law, or sometimes the Book of the Law. This is the origin of the title of the Book of the Law in Thelema, is this Book of Sacred Law that's on the altar in the Masonic observances, and that you take your oath on. And then there's the compass and square. And these are called the 3 lights of Freemasonry. They have to be present for a lodge of Masons to be open. This has to be on the altar. It's the basic symbol of Freemasonry. And then those are called the 3 greater lights of Freemasonry. And then there's also 3 lesser lights of Freemasonry. And these are the sun and the moon and the worshipful master. And the idea there is that just as the movements of the sun and the moon govern the day and the night, the worshipful master governs the lodge. That's the rubric. Okay, so then they're brought to the altar, where they kneel and they take an oath. And let's see, it's the obligation. So, and this is, I name, of my own free will and accord, in the presence of Almighty God in this worshipful lodge erected to him and dedicated to the holy Saints John, do hereby and hereon most solemnly and sincerely promise and swear that I will always hail, ever conceal, and never reveal any of the arts, parts, or points of the hidden mysteries of ancient and accepted Freemasonry, which may have been or hereafter shall be at this time or any future period communicated to me as such to any person or persons whomsoever accepted me to a true and lawful brother Mason, or in a regularly constituted lodge of Masons, nor unto him or them until by strict trial, due examination, or lawful information, I shall have found him or them as lawfully entitled to the same as I am myself. I furthermore promise and swear that I will not print, paint, stamp, stain, cut, carve, mark, or engrave them, or cause the same to be done on anything movable or immovable, capable of receiving the least impression of a word, syllable, letter, or character, whereby the same may become legible or intelligible to any person under the canopy of heaven, and the secrets of Freemasonry thereby unlawfully obtained through my unworthiness. All this I most solemnly, sincerely promise and swear with a firm and steadfast resolution to perform the same without any mental reservation or secret evasion of mine whatever, finding myself under no less a penalty than that of having my throat cut across, my tongue torn out by its roots, and my body buried in the rough sands of the sea at low water mark, where the tide ebbs and flows twice in 24 hours, should I ever knowingly violate this, my entered apprentice obligation, so help me God and keep me steadfast in the due performance of the same. And that's the oath whereby you're admitted as a Mason. Now, according to the official interpretation of this obligation and oath by the Grand Lodge of the state of California, under whose jurisdiction I was initiated in due order, this oath is to be interpreted not literally, but only symbolically or allegorically. And therefore, as a matter of official policy, all details of the Masonic 3 degrees of initiation are freely discussable by any Mason under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of California to any other person whatsoever. And that the only things that should be admitted as a matter of privacy are the particular specific forms or versions of the step signs and grips that are actually given in the Grand Lodge of California rites, as opposed to those that are more generally known that, for example, are depicted here in this book, which I'm free to discuss with you as well. There might be some small variations to these that I can neither confirm nor deny in the California version of these rites. And that I just won't, out of politeness, I won't mention. But otherwise, everything of this is discussable to any non-Mason. And the reason is because you're trying to get people interested in your stuff to join your club. And if you keep it secret, you can't discuss what you're about. And the whole point of the club is to have stuff that you can talk about to discuss because it's your stuff. And all of this stuff has been public for centuries and is available continuously in print or on the internet or whatever forever. And so there's no point in pretending that it's secret. So if you're actually a Mason, contrary to popular superstition, none of this stuff is actually secret in any literal sense. It's just secret in the sense that people continue to not, in popular regular society, know all the details about it. And so it continues to have this sort of popular esoteric cachet, but it's just club insignia and stuff that, can be freely discussed. And in fact, should be to get people interested in Masonry so that maybe they can join it or be involved in it. And I'm saying this because I wish more magical orders, particularly in the neo-pagan community, would actually understand better the material that they're using, particularly the Masonic initiatory material that they are perhaps not necessarily aware of, but which they're interpreting often in this kind of literalistic or fundamentalist way that's actually not a part of actual Freemasonry. So Freemasonry is a club that you join to hang out with your friends and have dinners together. And as the Freemasons like to say, the true secrets are incommunicable. And what that means is that the real secrets are the meaningfulness of all of these rites and symbols that you discover by actually practicing and being involved in the ritual activity of something like a Masonic lodge in whatever context that would actually be, whether it's called Freemasonry or not, whether it's called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, whether it's called Ordo Templi Orientis, whether it's called Rosicrucian, this, that, or the other. They've got Amorc down in San Jose, but there's innumerable magical successors to Freemasonry that, again, have more or less of an esoteric purpose, or again, are just a social club. And they're symbolic of a lot of what goes on in their symbolism needs to be understood as a spiritual metaphor and not necessarily interpreted in a straightforward, literal way, precisely because if you do interpret it too literally, you're actually missing the meaning of what's going on, missing the actual social purpose and function of these different things. And that's that all of these rites of secrecy are supposed to mean that you're supposed to be true with your friends, that you're supposed to have honor in your dealings with others, and not be either a gossip or a jerk. And really, this is all a system of morality veiled in allegory. That's the official description. Um, and so even and especially when this all is repurposed to take on a magical function, which it doesn't necessarily so much explicitly have in an actual Freemasonic context. But in the case of many of the magical orders that succeed and are based on Freemasonry, again, as a way to have a club, as a way to structure an initiatory experience. In a way, if you think of Freemasonry as a exoteric outer order, and you could imagine then another magical order, even one that's still technically in a way an outer order, but that would, as it were, put the batteries back into the machine so that it operates. In a way, and I don't necessarily mean this derogatorily, what Freemasonry does is it has these implicitly esoteric and magical rituals that it performs, but it takes the batteries out when it actually does them, and so they're encountered exoterically rather than esoterically. That doesn't mean that the individual members couldn't, when they're themselves performing or being involved in these rituals, as we're putting the batteries back together. But that's not really the function of a Masonic lodge, which is to hang out with your friends and have dinner together. That really is the sorry folks, that's Masonry. That's what it is. And so when you do repurpose it, as many people have done for centuries, to make it into an esoteric, initiatory, esoteric function where you actually work the rituals as magical rituals, which anybody can get together and do. And our own tradition is, of course, very much based on people doing exactly that. When you're doing that, it's important to understand that this still functions as a kind of metaphor that's directing you towards what are ultimately inner states or attainments, and that some of this stuff, if taken too literally, can become, I don't know, politically destabilizing. Anyway, we can discuss that more when we get to the end. I do want to finish going through the actual initiation ritual, because there's interesting stuff that happens, and you may find that you're recognizing some of these details as we're going through, because of the basis for many magical stuff that happens in other orders. So they've taken this oath at the altar, and then their hoodwink is removed, and then the worshipful master instructs, who's now not the candidate, but now referred to as a brother Mason, in the step, sign, grip, and word of the entered apprentice. And in the further two grades of Freemasonry and then higher grades, there's different versions of this that correspond. So the sign is something you do with your hands to indicate. The step, you step forward with your foot a certain way to take the first step in Freemasonry. Then in the second degree and third degree, you follow that with an additional step to take the steps in Freemasonry. And then the grip is a certain handshake that you give to a fellow Mason to identify yourself as a Mason. And then you exchange a particular word that's done by lettering back and forth. You each say one letter back as you work your way through the word. And this is a token of recognition where you can recognize or identify another Mason. If you were to run into somebody and they were to say that they were a Mason and you wanted to test them, which never, ever actually occurs in real life, and usually for a very good reason, which is that most Masons who are actual Masons learn this stuff when they're first initiated, and they have to memorize it for when they go through the first 3 degrees. And then years later, they're still Masons and they've forgotten it. So they're Masons, but they'll just tell you that they're a Mason, and why would they not be telling the truth? And that's how you actually identify other Masons, which is you just ask and they tell you, and you don't. Nobody actually does this because people don't remember it. So it is done in lodge. And that's really its function, particularly during the initiations itself. Anyway, so then they're garbed in a white apron, which is the basic symbol of being a Mason, the thing that you wear in the lodge to identify yourself as a Mason. And this is said to represent their purity. And it's a white lambskin, at least during the initiation itself. When you're actually in lodge, that's a little bit expensive. So usually you just have a linen substitute that you actually wear in the lodge. But the official apron and the one that you're actually given in the ritual is a lambskin. This alludes to, I'm always reminded of this Gnostic text from late antiquity. It's called the Hymn of the Pearl. And the Hymn of the Pearl is a divine ascent text where in your astral body of light, you ascend up through the heavens. And then when you reach the highest heaven, you're clothed in a white robe to represent your purity. And it's a symbol of gnosis, in other words, the white apron that you're given in Masonry. And this is part of what makes Masonry fun, which is that it incorporates all this esoteric stuff that is it's like a Freudian unconscious content that the people who are performing the ritual may not understand, but it's a code that anybody at any time can show up and understand and reappropriate or remember as it's specifically esoteric function. So it's all there for Freemasonry to function as a legitimate esoteric initiatory system, and anybody coming through it can use it as such. It's just that it itself, it's like Freud's unconscious. It doesn't necessarily itself as a club know that it's doing that. And there are many people there who don't know or understand or say that they know, but don't actually understand that this is how it's supposed to be working in this way. But them's the breaks. So after being garbed in the apron, they're taken back to the chamber of reflection where they put back on their suit and their outer clothing. And then they put the apron back on, and then they're brought in fully clothed in the suit and collared shirt and the white apron, and then what's called the second point of the ritual. So the first point was the taking of the oath, signs, scripts, words, etc. And then they're brought in for the second point where they're instructed in what's called the lecture of the grade, and or excuse me, the lecture of the degree. And so then the officers deliver the lecture. And this often involves, for different degrees, that you're shown what's called a tracing board, which is a board that has illustrated on it different Masonic symbols, which are then explained to you, or sometimes they'll have the actual thing that they're talking about that they'll show you. And these are different in the different degrees. In the first degree, what they show you is the rule, the gavel, the two pillars. Oh, did I mention there's two pillars in the temple? Okay. The three greater lights of Freemasonry, the three lesser lights of Freemasonry, the three candles that are about the altar, which represent the three lesser lights. And then there's this thing called the rough and the hewn ashlar, or building block, that's supposed to represent how you're refining yourself and your morality and so forth. And these are presented, and some of these symbols may differ depending on the particular observance. There's a kind of basic form inherited of Freemasonry in terms of how the degrees work. But then each particular Grand Lodge has its own specific interpretation of how they actually make that happen in the actual ritual that they put on. And the exact precise script might differ in a few points where there's certain ways that it's arranged based on how that particular Grand Lodge feels they're supposed to structure it. So that's the basic first degree. And then in the second degree, this repeats the procedure, but there's additional variations and symbols. and it's revealed that the lodge is actually supposed to be occurring within this Solomon's temple, and you're taking up a symbolic staircase to go up to the higher floors where you're going to receive the further initiations. And then there's the famous third degree of Freemasonry, which completes the basic Blue Lodge system and makes you a full member. And this is the legend of Hiram Abiff, who's the architect is said in the Bible to be the architect of King Solomon's temple. And then the candidate is identified with that person. And there's a kind of play that goes on where Hiram Abiff is murdered by 3 different assassins who are trying to get the Master Mason's word from him. And he refuses to give it to him. So they do 3 wounds to him that correspond to the penalties for the violating the obligations of the 3 different oaths that you take in the first 3 degrees. And then you're symbolically slain, and the candidate is laid out on the floor and covered with a rug. There's various speeches and things that occur. And then the worshipful master will then raise the candidate as a 3rd degree Mason in a special grip. That's the 3rd degree grip. And then they're given the 3rd degree word. But then they're told in the ritual that this is a substitute word, and that the actual word of the true Master Mason has been lost, and that their job now is to recover that word. And this is an indication that there's an esoteric interpretation to the rituals that have just been occurring. And of course, it should be obvious, especially for any readers of the Golden Bough in Victorian times, but also for us as magicians, that the form of the rite that's practiced in the 3rd degree is a version of the mysteries of the Eon of Osiris, and is what's called the formula of the dying and rising God. And that this also has connections to the Rosicrucian Christian mysteries, and that Hiram Abiff is a type of the risen, mysterious Christ, the apocalyptic Christ who occurs in the Book of Revelations, the spirit presence of the divinized human body of that's associated with the historical Jesus in the Christian mysteries. And then, of course, this is also analogous to the uncorrupted body of Christian Rosenkreutz that's found in the vault in the Rosicrucian mysteries. And of course, this all appears again in the 5=6 Adeptus Minor ritual in the Golden Dawn. And so all of these things are then linked together and then synthesized and rethought in the Book of the Law in Thelema. And so we're dealing with some of the core mysteries, if you will, or at least initiatory traditions in modernity that feed into the Thelemic mysteries as well. Anyway, I've got a number of kind of discussion topics, things that we can talk about. Freemasonry, I do want to pause at this point. We're nearly at the hour mark. We've got a little while. We can talk about this, and then I've got some more stuff that I want to say as well. But I do want to open up for some questions if people want to ask me about what we've just looked at, or make their own comments or reflections, or get the discussion rolling. If you want to talk about something in particular, ask me anything. Henry, go ahead.
This might be on your topic list already, but back when you were talking about taking the batteries out and putting the batteries back in,
yes,
you said something about the destabilizing effects, and I didn't really follow what you were saying at that part. Can we talk about that some?
Sure. Could you say more about what you think that I meant about the destabilizing?
Well, I think you were talking about what the outcome of putting the batteries back in might be, and I think you meant it in like a political sense. But
sure. Well, okay. Well, what I mean by that is this too, which is that because it's just in and of itself, it's just a club. Freemasonry can take on a different and varied functions depending on where it is and who's involved with it. So, for example, as I mentioned, in England, it's mostly a gentleman's club. In France, it often had a more political aspect to it. Now, of course, when I say that in England, Freemasonry is a gentleman's club, it also has a political connotation, but it's a conservative political connotation. It's a gentleman's club of the placeholders of the class society in England who maintain their position through this kind of special club that they're part of and co-recognize each other as having this status. In France, Freemasonry came to take on a more revolutionary function, whether this was, and takes on particularly an association with the Enlightenment and the promotion of Enlightenment values, and particular radical Enlightenment values, whether these are democracy, deism, meaning rejection of literal interpretation of exoteric Christian religion. Basically a kind of atheism, except it's not called that. The belief that the personalistic monotheistic God that's depicted in the biblical tradition is a myth and isn't necessarily the way that the divine should be thought of. And so you get things like the Grand Orient in France, and also more revolutionary political activity associated with the French Revolution. Various of the revolutionary cells associated with the revolution, and those have different political persuasions. They're not all on one side necessarily. Were often organized as Masonic lodges formally, but then you're joining this Masonic lodge, which is dedicated to this political, overthrowing the king or whatever. It was important in revolutionary North America with the 13 colonies when they break away from the British crown. Often in George Washington's army, military units were organized as Masonic lodges in parallel. So the democratic values associated with the American Revolutionary War are closely associated ritually or culturally with Freemasonry as co-sharing certain Enlightenment emancipatory values. And I think those feed very much directly into Thelema as well. There's also a democratic quality to Freemasonry itself as well. Each lodge is basically politically independent. They have a charter, but they organize all their activity by voting. The worshipful master is changed every year. It has to be voted in by the members of the lodge, and all decisions are made by voting. The worshipful master is president of the lodge, but they're president in the sense that they are then presiding officer of the business meeting, which is the democratic meeting of all the members of the lodge, which vote on everything. And there's some, business executive authority that the worshipful master has to make decisions, but it's all has to be answerable to the lodge. And so this is also a democratic ideal that I think it would be worthwhile if, again, more contemporary to our own tradition, magical orders would be more cognizant of the importance of democracy as part of the tradition that they're kind of using as the format for their ritual workings. And so when magical orders that are organized in this kind of Masonic initiatory way, when they become more authoritarian, this is in a way a kind of betrayal of the principles that they're supposedly organized to perpetuate. And again, I think that should have some relevance I argue for the relevance of that ideal in a Thelemic context. And then in Germany, often high or upper Masonic degree rights have a cult relation, and so they're associated with German Romanticism and having a kind of a cult or esoteric aspect as well, and often being associated with certain types of magical activity. And then in um, places like Northern Ireland, often some of the really nasty Protestant, racist, there's no better term to describe them, militias, military militias that were formed in Northern Ireland to that they were organized as Masonic. And so there are in existence certain what you could call domestic terrorist organizations that are organized as Masonic lodges. And these can sometimes be associated with hard right or fascistic political organizations. And sometimes these have been organized also in Italy as well, where there's a lot of kind of political gangs often engaged in terrorism that are organized around being Masonic lodges. There was a right-wing Masonic lodge in Italy, for example, that carried out some right-wing bombings in the 1970s, I think, for example. So again, the different ways to think about the ways that the magical formula, as it were, of Freemasonry could be applied to different uses or contexts. Henry, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. Dan or Joe, do you have any questions or comments about the?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
So maybe on the same lines as like putting the batteries back in, that alludes that the batteries were in it at one time in the beginning. And my internet was kind of out towards the beginning. I don't know. Did you talk about, like, do we know much about those magical origins, or did we just know that they come from like Rosicrucianism, alchemy? But do you know anything more specific about like how those were formulated?
The short answer, yeah,
historical or mythological context, I guess.
sure. Historically, the answer is that we don't know who started Freemasonry as a club in Scotland. And so basically, the first 3 degrees derive from an earlier, probably less complicated version of this ritual that was done in pubs in Scotland in the late 1600s. And formal chartering doesn't really begin until the 18th century, so we don't have records of what's happening before the formulation of the. There are some documents that precede the formation of the United Grand Lodge of England, but they're ambiguous, and it's not always clear what's really going on. And so I think that it's not always necessarily the case that. Let me put that another way. Historically, it's not necessarily the case that at any point the batteries were in. That Freemasonry may always have been exoteric, may always have been something that a bunch of mates got together at the pub and thought would be funny, would be a lark to do. And somebody had some books in their library that had what seemed like some fun, esoteric seeming stuff that they kind of randomly cobbled together ad hoc. And then later on, particularly in the 18th century, people who are more serious about wanting to figure out a kind of myth of origins for the movement that they were part of got more elaborate about speculating about how, Freemasonry derived from the building of the ancient Egyptian pyramids, for example, and Thoth was the first initiate, or stuff that's basically nonsense like that. But it's fun to read about because it's so preposterous. There's kind of like an almost Ancient Aliens type of narrative associated with, and I do mean that in a vulgar to kind of criticize the seriousness of this. And there's many an armchair historian at any Masonic lodge that you might become a member of or meet people associated with, who can tell you about their own speculations. if I were to say that there was like a specific myth of origin that does kind of run through like a thread, it's at least this idea, however not grounded in actual history, it might or might not actually be, that so-called speculative Freemasonry is supposedly has some kind of historical derivation. Again, what historical derivation means concretely is not clear at all, but is somehow supposed to derive from so-called operative Freemasonry, which are these stonemasons guilds in the medieval period. The people who were building cathedrals, who were organized into professional guilds, and that ostensibly had some kind of initiation ritual for their guild that supposedly you're going through some kind of version of when you're becoming a speculative Mason, so that you can study the symbolism of the stonemason's tools as an allegory of morality, to like make you a better person. Now, that again is still kind of exoteric. That this is all structured around some kind of like that it does amount to a kind of Gnostic mystery cultus is obvious to anyone magically inclined when they look at these rituals. It's obvious that that's what's going on. Again, this is why I keep comparing it to like the psychoanalytic unconscious. The fact that this is the case is kind of unconscious to Freemasonry as a constitutive feature of Freemasonry, meaning that it's not just an incidental feature that, as I say, the batteries are out, but that it's set up to operate that way because there's this exoteric concern that they wouldn't be able to handle what would happen if they put the batteries back in. It's like the warning in H.P. Lovecraft's The Necronomicon, where it's alleged, of course it's not an actual book, but he says that there's this passage in it where it says, Alhazred, the person who wrote it, writes, don't summon up what you can't put down. And so if you were to actually activate Freemasonry as a Gnostic mystery cultus, you might not be able to politically control what would happen because that might generate some kind of emancipatory current. And if you're a British social club of Tory, or Whig placeholders, and you want to have some beer after working out the last parliamentary bill, you're not there to have any kind of free thought weirdness at your, you want to just talk about the subjects that you're comfortable with. There's an actual rule in regular Freemasonry that you're not allowed to discuss politics or religion. But if you're not allowed to talk about politics or religion, then what are you talking about? And the answer is you're talking about lodge finances, and you kind of argue a bit about money and how you're shopping and how your wife is doing, and saying hi to your mates and drinking some beer. And that's pretty much what Masonry is. And so just as you're prohibited, at least officially, from having it be political or religious, so you're kind of, it's set up to not let you actually do it magically. So that's why when magicians come along and they get involved in Freemasonry, like, oh, I could turn this into a magical group, they usually start a different observance that runs in parallel to or separate from Masonry, whether that's BOTA or the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn or various groups that are called Rosicrucian, the Societas Rosicruciana and Anglica, for example, which is the Hermetic and Rosicrucian study group that high-grade Masons in England were invited to join, that the founders of the Golden Dawn, Woodman, Westcott, and Mathers, were all members of that. And they were like, well, okay, we want to do something like the SRIA, where we can study all these magical stuff and do magical Masonry. Well, we want to actually do some magical rituals. So you can't actually do that in regular Freemasonry, but we're Masons, we'll just start another order. That's what Masons always do. They just start another order. So they started the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So, again, anybody can come along at any time and put the batteries back in. It's just that you're kind of not doing Freemasonry anymore when you're doing that. You're doing magical masonry, you're doing ritual magic, you're doing what we're doing. But there is also this fun club that you can join that's called Freemasonry that still exists and has this connection to what we're doing. And if you go through these club rituals, you can of course get something magical out of them, but you have to be the one to you can put the batteries in yourself as it were. You're part of the ritual. I don't know if that answers your question, Joe. There's obviously more to be said.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, as far as one is able to, I suppose.
Okay, sure. It's a little bit disappointing in the sense that, you want masonry, the fabled masonry to amount to something, and it does, but it's exoteric, and there's all this stuff implied, but you kind of have to take it and develop it in a kind of slightly separate context to really make something of it. But that's always been the case. It's just part of what the actual historical Freemasonry actually means, is it has this aspect to it. But you could say it's a kind of mythology. It's a set of symbols. And so those always are going to signify more than they mean in their original context. And so Freemasonry is it's this text that calls for a sequel, right? What happens in the third degree? You're given the Master Mason's word, but then you're told it's a substitute word, right? Because there's actually the real word that you still have to find. But then that's the quest, right? That's you're trying to find the true word of the magical operation of building yourself, and that's the true will. But you've got to find the word that's the name of your holy guardian angel that's going to give you that Gnostic initiation. But it's something you kind of have to do that isn't provided by the club. And that's why I'm saying that Freemasonry is what's called an outer order. And there is an inner order, but you have to initiate yourself as everybody who's a member of it does. And that's the arrangement, at least traditionally. Dan, did you have any questions or anything you might want us to ask me or that we could talk about?
No, you kind of actually answered it while answering Joe's question. I was just going to comment on the fact that Crowley seems to chastise or kind of poke fun at the Masons in some of the writings, and then you referring to it as a supper club, basically, as well. But then you kind of got into how that's a beneficial, what we might draw out of it. So that was really all. You answered it all. Thank you.
Sure. So Crowley does make fun of Freemasonry. And the reason he does that is that he is himself a Mason, and all Masons make fun of Freemasonry in this way. It's kind of like part of being part of Freemasonry, which is that you make fun of how Freemasonry doesn't amount to everything because you're on the quest for the true word. And so you're gonna make something of it. But you're aware that it's this puzzle that still needs to be solved, and that is in a way its function, its role. I think some of this also relates to, and I'll close today's class with this this additional reflection, which is that we could think of Freemasonry in terms of this transition that I've talked about in some of the other classes, from the allegory to the symbol. So as the basic trope for fiction, there's a transition from the pre-modern medieval period where the major trope for doing narrative is what's called the allegory. And this particularly is done with religious allegories, but these can also be political. And in the allegory, there's a kind of one-to-one connection between a particular motif or sign and its intended meaning. And this occurs within a closed social order where everybody is supposed to know their place and role within a fixed, organic, hierarchical order of being. Okay, transition to modernity. And instead of being in this closed Ptolemaic system, which is bounded by the sphere of fixed stars with the Earth in the center, instead we're in the Copernican open universe of infinite space-time, where the Earth and all the other planets orbit around the sun, and then the sun orbits around the galaxy, and everything is just in this free, open space where there is no center, but anywhere can be, every inertial frame of reference could have its own coordinate system to treat it as the center of the universe from the point of view of its own perspective. So what's going on with Freemasonry is that it's kind of it's a set of symbols or metaphors that affects this transition or is linked to this transition. And so it itself presents a relatively set of straightforward moral allegories, one-to-one correlations between a set of symbols, which are the stonemason's tools, the rule, the plumb, the square, the rough ashlar, etc. And these are related allegorically to a straightforward moral system of being a better person, which is at least formally exoteric. But because Freemasonry is now functioning in a modern context, the one-to-one function of the allegory mutates into this new modern symbolic context where the symbol replaces the allegory. What makes the symbol different is that the symbol is a metaphor that's more ambiguous and open-ended and is subject to multiple complex interpretations, and it can signify multiple things at the same time. These can overlap in more complex ways. And it ultimately refers to the ambiguous openness of human existence to make meaning for itself in what Nietzsche calls will to power. So, and then the symbol is ultimately a call, as it were, to human freedom, to make ourselves into our own divine purposes. And of course, I'm jumping all the way forward through modernity of Thelema to make that sort of evaluation, because as Hegel says, the owl of Minerva flies at the dusk. In historical processes, the best vantage point to understand a historical process is always at the end point or present of that, looking back on the past. So looking back, we can see that there's this shift in narrative function from medieval society to modern society. And so what happens is that Freemasonry itself becomes a symbol. And so it becomes ambiguated. And the original simple ethical allegory now takes on all these dramatic, esoteric, Gnostic, mystery cultic significations. But the meaning of the symbols to get to that, or how that connects to it, is now ambiguous. Everybody who comes along has to make their own kind of interpretation, how they're going to square the circle, as the Book of the Law puts it, to in this circle squared is the mystery. As you're going to find the missing word, so like Thelema, or perhaps Abrahadabra, or the Crowley's interpretation of the missing word that's given in the OTO third degree, or some other magical word that you might come up with, or formula or symbol that's going to help mediate this transition. So in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is that Freemasonry becomes this kind of bridge from the mysteries and the esoteric lore and content and spiritualities and versions of Gnosticism that preceded modernity. And by being initiated into Masonry or coming into dialogue, whether you're a formal initiate of this particular club or not, by being involved in the ritual magical traditions that we are, we've come into dialogue with the symbolism of Freemasonry, which serves as a symbol of this transition from inheriting this medieval and earlier traditional religious and spiritual content, but then having to readapt its meaning in a modern context. And so the fact that Masonry itself is kind of open-ended, and it leaves you at the end of the third degree knowing that that's what you have to do, but not having actually fully accomplished that, is itself in a way the very initiation into the conditions of modernity that is our condition, that is what we're supposed to then be doing. So in a way, by problematizing Masonry, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm also in that very ambiguating, pointing out what's important about Masonry as this thing that we've inherited as part of our tradition from the past, but then it calls for reinterpretation, which is precisely what Masonry is. It's just a bunch of symbols that call for reinterpretation. And you're being brought into agency in the initiation to carry out that alchemical, interpretive, hermeneutical operation. Hermeneutical as in Hermes, Mercury, Thoth. Thoth is the first Mason initiating the builders of the temples in Egypt, which didn't actually happen, but is, it's the myth. Okay, we've got just a few more minutes. Any other questions or comments before we close out?
Would you be able to talk about maybe Freemasons' influence more on America? You mentioned George Washington already. Maybe like the Bill of Rights, things like that.
It's the Enlightenment ideal of democracy.
Yeah,
is the point.
That comes out of is that the French Masonry you're saying?
Well, but all the founding fathers in the United States are also French influenced intellectuals. So their political culture comes from England and the type of liberalism that emerges after the English Civil War, but their philosophy comes from France. And their participation in what we might call the radical Enlightenment, which is the bourgeois democratic revolutions that are beginning to break out at this time, of which the American Revolution is the great type. The culture that's also, Freemasonry is also kind of part of that culture, because the structure of the lodge is a democratically administered structure. And so the kind of social lesson, if you want, of being part of a Masonic club is that you're supposed to be part of this democratic society within your own class. And then there's this kind of political ideal that emerges as part of that, as part of the larger narrative that's going on in culture about how that might play out politically as well. That reaches its most radical form in the late 1700s in the United States, where in the American Constitution that eventually emerges, there's not just the removal of the aristocracy from power, there's the elimination of the aristocracy as a class in the United States, that it is illegal under the American Constitution to give people a title. And so what that means is that an entire social class has been revolutionarily overthrown and actually eliminated as a class. And that means the full emancipation of the bourgeoisie, the owners of property, as the governing class of society, which is an utterly radical thing that had never before happened in human history, and is linked to, as part of that conversation, there's these esoteric currents of which Freemasonry is part of that. And there's other stuff too. Next week, we're going to be looking at one of the great theologians of the Enlightenment, a fellow by the name of Emanuel Swedenborg. And we'll be also talking about the way in which later on, particularly in the 20th century, the Enlightenment is interpreted in rationalistic terms as being opposed to and different from what we might call occultism. But in actual, more recently, in the last 20 years, it's become clear that this is and this starts back in the 60s, this reevaluation too. We'll talk about this more next week, but it becomes clear that that narrative isn't right, and that in fact, what we would call esotericism is very much involved in the most radical parts of the democratic enlightenment that's occurring in the 1700s. And we're going to look at one of the major figures in the rethinking of theology and spirituality in terms of radical emancipatory enlightenment from a esoteric perspective involving a kind of Gnosticism. And the major figure in that is a person by the name of Emanuel Swedenborg, who's super interesting. And we're going to be looking at him next week, and I hope everybody will join us for that. We're about at 3:30, so I'm going to sign off. Anybody else have anything to say before we sign off? Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I'll see you all next week, okay? 93.